It's a long way to Tipperary, it's a long way to go. It's a long way to Tipperary, to the sweetest girl I know. Goodbye, Piccadilly, farewell, Leicester Square. It's a long, long way to Tipperary, but my heart's right there.
Ladies and gentlemen, I'm wired up. I feel almost like something out of Spinal Tap, and I'm going to sort of spontaneously explode. It's the graveyard shift, as you know. If you fall asleep, fine. I'll wake you up in time for tea afterwards, but I can empathise with you because I've reached that certain age as well that an after-lunch nap is the sort of thing that I like as well. I guarantee you, though, that if you do fall asleep, you will miss something spectacular, and that is my ability with IT. Because I tried emailing the slides to David, and of course it wouldn't happen. And I got an email back saying, well, do you use this, that? And I just emailed back to him and said, sorry, I don't even understand your questions. I said to him earlier on that where I work, people come to my lectures, they're standing in the aisles, not because they're the least bit interested in anything I have to say, but they know there's going to be an IT disaster. And I hope that it won't happen today, but just be prepared. Right, it's very much in the news, of course, the reserves again at the moment with the MOD wanting to, well, the MOD doesn't particularly want to, but the politicians want the territorials to be increased again up to a magnificent size of about 30-odd thousand. They're dipped down to about 20 just below, but now, of course, with the Future Forces 2020 and Reserves 2020, they're very much back in the news again. The regular army, as we will, or as I will say during the course of the next hour, is still very much anti the reserves to a greater or lesser extent. And this is nothing new as far as the MOD or the old War Office is concerned. You will think, or I'm sure you will remember that Sir John French said in his book 1914, when he praised the TF, and he said it's held the line wonderfully, they were there during the first winter and spring of the war, they did magnificent work, and then the battles of the early spring and summer of 1915 as well, and he wanted 50-odd Territorial Force battalions to be sent over in order to take part in his proposed assault on Zeebrugge. In a post-war regimental history sort of echoed that idea from French when it said, in August 1914, the British territorial soldier was, without exception, the finest volunteer soldier in the world's armies. His training is excellent, his equipment good, his enthusiasm unbounded. Now, most of this, of course, was just complete hyperbole, because A, there weren't too many other volunteer forces or armies in the world that you could compare him against. His training was patchy at best, largely inadequate for most of them. But what he did have, or what so many of them did have, was this unbounded enthusiasm. But he had to. Any territorial soldier had to be enthusiastic because being a member of the TF cost him money. It meant he had to give up most of his holidays, if not all of his holidays. He had weekend commitments and he had evening commitments as well. So he had to have a good degree of commitment if he was going to stay in it. But this was the great problem as far as the War Office thought. There are nowhere near sufficient people to be able to create a force with formation, spirit, esprit, to reach a good degree of training and an effective structure and organisation with leadership and command in order to be able to do what the Territorial Force was supposed to do. So what was it? Very briefly, I'll just deal with the TF. As you know, founded by Haldane 1908, largely because the old rifle volunteers were so inefficient, they were barely under War Office control. Thousands of them had volunteered, about 20-odd thousand of those had volunteered to fight in South Africa, and Haldane wanted to capitalise on this idea of voluntarism in order to create a cheap but better territorial force. And it avoided, because it was cheap, compulsory national service. The original idea was it was going to be locally raised, democratic, even Hegelian, if you like, which would provide the means of reinforcing the regular army by providing backfill, by doing lines of communication work, and sometimes, or in Haldane's original intent, as an overseas force in its own right. But, as you know, political necessities meant that he wasn't able to achieve this, and so it concentrated on home defence. That's what it was supposed to be. But the essential criteria, as far as Haldane was concerned, was that it avoided the introduction of conscription and it was cheap. And training, even better, was now going to be under the control of the War Office, which, as I say, the Rifle Volunteers were not. In 1913, its establishment was just a little bit over 300,000. 14 divisions, deliberately mirroring the same structure as the regular army, and it was also 14 brigades of yeomanry. In 1913, there were only 13 cyclist battalions. That was going to increase the year after. There are also other elements like the VAD, the Technical Reserve, the Territorial Force Reserve itself, which was an abject failure, and the National Reserve. And there were other stranger auxiliaries as well, for example, the Corps of Guides, which was supposed to help if any invasion came. What the Corps of Guides was essentially gamekeepers and poachers who had a green felt hat, who was their uniform, and they were supposed to know all the little back roads and lanes and things where they would be able to direct the territorial force in the event of raid or invasion. The associations, the county associations administered it. They were headed by the Lord's Lieutenant, and they had been told emphatically by the king that you support this territorial force. That had been made very clear to them. The committees comprised of local dignitaries, businessmen, and so on. They were responsible for administering it, running it, or dealing with the finance. And there were about 90 of those. It varied in number. Smaller associations were created. And even during the war, there were applications to create more county associations. They ranged from the County of London, who had about responsible for literally dozens of units, and about 27,000 men, down to Kinross, which had a company of about 110 men, which was all it was responsible for. Excuse me. Now, why was it necessary? Well, Adrian mentioned earlier on about the Battle of Dorking, the 1871 novel, and then the rash of invasion novels, Childers, Le Queux, and so on. And he mentioned as well, if you ever get or come across it, Clarence MacAndrew Chugwater. He's the 14-year-old in Wodehouse's book who thwarts this German invasion. It really is a very amusing book. But these all fueled the invasion scare, the so-called invasion scare of 1909. Remember as well, think in terms, Scott, I don't think did quite mention it, but the we want 8 and we won't wait as far as the construction of the battle fleet was, or increase. This sort of fired up the British people because, A, they did genuinely fear that there could well be an invasion. The centuries-old, and this was exacerbated by the fact that the centuries-old fear of France had gone, and with it had gone London's defences. This was a series of forts which started up in Essex, crossed the Thames by a pontoon bridge round about where the QE bridge is now, and then circled around onto the North Downs. They'd been dismantled. If there were going to be an invasion, then it was going to come from Germany, and Germany was going to land in East Anglia. So the axis of any advance towards the capital was now going to have shifted. Again, we've heard mentioned this morning the Naval League, the National Service League, and so on. There were various schemes that these organisations and others had on the books that they wanted some form of conscription or national service for both the regulars and the home defence. But an important point to remember, for all its alleged shortcomings, the TF was a strategic and political force of some importance because, although it was treated with a great deal of suspicion by the Conservatives, because it had been, or the Unionists, I should say, because it had been founded by a fairly radical Liberal government, it meant that if a European war did erupt, then the expeditionary force would be able to sail to the continent. Although the few British divisions which would then be sent over to France were unlikely to make any great difference, it was assessed at the time, as far as the operational outcome was concerned, what it did show was, of course, British commitment. And they couldn't have had that commitment if it were not for a degree of faith in the territorial force behind. So what was the anticipation? The public perception of a full-scale invasion, of putting the country to fire and sword and the advance upon the capital and so on, was there. They'd had two invasion inquiries, 1903, 1908, both of which had come to the same conclusion. This was the War Office who had been looking at this. If there were to be one, they decided that it would be this so-called bolt from the blue. But that would require something like 200-odd vessels, which would need to be assembled along the North German coast. There would have to be an embarkation period of about 48 hours, and by that time, British agents in Germany would have been able to report it back, and also, of course, the home defence forces would have been deployed, and the fleet would have been ready to intercept. The War Office believed that if the Germans did try it, it would certainly be no more than 120,000 men. And these would be ill-equipped with artillery. Their lines of communication would be quickly severed by the Royal Navy, and thus it would wither essentially on the beaches. What the War Office was more concerned about was the prospect of raids. Now, these raids could have a very damaging effect on national morale. It could help induce panic. So it was these that the War Office considered that it had to confront. What were these raids? What sort of form were they likely to take? Well, they had various scenarios, such as German tramp steamers just sailing innocently up the rivers during the so-called precautionary period. They might have sort of 200 Marines on board, and then they would disgorge those to create mayhem somewhere in the river estuaries. There were block ships filled with cement that were going to be sunk in river estuaries or off docks. Swarms of torpedo boats sailing up the rivers and torpedoing the lock gates and the dock facilities. Cruisers marauding around, shelling shore establishments. Marines coming up to Chatham and Woolwich with demolition parties to blow up some of the important sites there. And even it wasn't beyond the possibility, the War Office thought, that virtual suicide raids by pre-dreadnoughts would come up the rivers again and disgorge their Marines or their troops ashore. But no scenario was ever conceiving of more than 60,000 troops at any one time doing this. The official view for public consumption was that anti-invasion measures and provisions were entirely adequate. The TF divisions came under the 6 home commands, all of which had a few regular troops attached to them as well. And by 1911, every territorial force unit knew where its war station was and how it was going to get to it. The National Reserve and elements of the TF would guard the vulnerable points, such as Scott mentioned earlier on, where the telegraphic cables come ashore, they were going to be crucial. As far as communications were concerned, the railway network, the reservoirs, the power stations, these were the sorts of things which the National Reserve was going to be responsible for in order to alleviate or relieve, I should say, the territorials of some of their responsibilities. the two regular divisions, the 4th and 6th, which were going to be kept behind from the expeditionary force, were going to be stationed at Aldershot and London, and they would be ready to deploy towards the East Coast if and when and needs be. Those forces would be supported by the 9 divisions of the so-called Central Force. That was divided into 3 armies. The Hotel Metropole was its headquarters, and the Central Force was going to deploy when necessary, and in the meantime, if the Germans had landed, the so-called local forces, which were the other 5 territorial divisions, plus the yeomanry and the cyclists, would be holding those as close to the beach as possible until the Central Force armies could get to them. Should the Germans attack major ports, there you had territorial RGA as well as some regulars. You had the TF engineers and electrical engineers and fortress companies. But remember too that regimental 3rd battalions were very largely based at the ports or on the coast. They were also a vital part of home defence. Now, a huge amount of effort had gone into assessing what local areas could supply in the way of food and provisions for the defending forces. In other words, as the central forces moved towards the coast and also the local forces already there. A huge amount of work involving the length of station platforms, how much available rolling stock there was, communication provisions as far as telephone exchanges, what day the local market operated, and even what was early closing day. This was all in what was called the War Book. And it meant that railway timetables had been drawn up. They knew how many trains they needed to shift a particular battalion, a particular battery, or whatever it was. The Lord's Lieutenant knew who they had to call upon to form the emergency committees. If the Germans did raid or invade, then the local civilian population would be evacuated. And there was also a scheme to flood the fens. I can't say that, fens. In other words, if they were coming down through Cambridgeshire and Huntingdon, it was going to be inundations there. And on paper, therefore, this looked to be a very comprehensive and imaginative plan, which indeed it was. And it was understood by the GOC-TF divisions. They knew where they had to go and what their job was supposed to be. Privately, the War Office believed the TF was adequate to defeat an enemy raid, but of course the nation needed to be convinced of this. Public opinion had to be educated to that fact, so the War Office believed, or part of the BEF would have to remain at home. And so for public consumption, it was agreed that the TF should be required to repel several simultaneous raids of between 5,000 and 10,000 German troops. That was the official stance. Only then, Kidgel, the DSD, the Director of Staff Duties, argued, would the public be able to understand that the TF was adequate and that the expeditionary force would be able to sail. It would also give the 6-month post-mobilization training period. Because the War Office, although the CIGS didn't entirely endorse it, the War Office believed that the chance of a major invasion in the first 6 months of the war was not going to happen anyway. That was very, very remote. So that would allow the TF to get up to some sort of standard of efficiency. We've got to ask, though, what do we mean by efficiency? Efficiency for what? If efficiency means sort of trying to make the most of what you have, then, okay, what does that involve? Does it mean making the most of your training, of your facilities, of the finance, of your command and control, your leadership, and so on? Those are the sort of aspects. In other words, to maximize your fighting power. Modern British doctrine today, army doctrine, talks of fighting power as 3 components: the physical, the moral, and the conceptual. In other words, you've got to know the character or understand the character of the war that you're likely to be fighting within the context of the global position. You've got to have the right sort of training, you've got to have sufficient manpower, you have to be able to sustain it, you have to have also ultimately the ethical foundations and the moral belief in what you're fighting for. Now, those sorts of things in modern parlance still apply to a great extent back down there in 1913. It's just that they're expressed differently. Efficiency, as far as they were concerned, the War Office, meant that you could put this sort of chap there to defend the shores, and everyone would understand that he's capable of doing it. Now, he's a particularly callow-looking youth. Anyone who knows anything about equipment, which I don't know a great deal about, I'm the first to confess, would be able to identify that he's got the old Longley Enfield, he's got a 1903 pattern bandolier. He's not equipped anywhere near the ordinary British Expeditionary Force or the regular army would be. But that's the sort of chap who was going to be condemned by sections of the press, which I'll come to later, for being inexperienced and far too youthful. If the public sustained their belief that he was typical of the Territorial Force, then the entire British continental strategy could be put into jeopardy because the Expeditionary Force might not sail. Even when it comes to the crunch, not all of the BEF was going to be earmarked, and a crucial decision had been made in February 1912 that the 4th and 6th Divisions would now become part of the BEF. I'm not going to go any further than that, Spencer, but that's crucial to home defence, right? Unfortunately, of course, large sections of the press influenced public opinion as it does today. We've heard about the Northcliffe Press. They were one of the great exponents and supporters of the idea that a home defence force should be somewhere between 500,000 and 600,000 men. The Territorial Force, as I say, then was 314,000. The fact that the public didn't have a huge amount of confidence in the TF was underlined when, again, Scott mentioned, I think this morning, the 1912 manoeuvres. Red Force managed to land an army of 28,000 men in the Humber Estuary under the eyes of the fleet, and the 1913 manoeuvres were ended abruptly as well because, again, the Red Force did much better than the home defence fleet and the regular forces were supposed to do. Not surprisingly, there was a huge amount of concern. Even Liberal MPs asked in the House of Commons comments about the state of the Territorials. One talked of its lamentable state and accused Seeley, of the Secretary of State for War at the time, for his temerity in suggesting that such a force would be able to defeat a group of, and they would be hand-picked, specialist German invaders or raiders. They're not going to throw your ordinary conscript into something like this. They would be specialist troops. Criticism came, as you can imagine, more regularly from the Unionist benches, who talked of the ludicrous standards of efficiency, and this was underlined again when only 50% of the men whose service expired in 1912, in other words, the 4-year men who had signed on in 1908, only 50% of those re-enlisted. One MP was prompted to ask the Secretary of State, such was the derision he felt that was being heaped upon the Territorials, to ban this review that was on in Manchester, which was simply called England's Last Hope, because he said it just heaped ridicule and contempt upon the Territorial Force. By September 13, the force had sunk to just over 245,000. Annual wastage was about 12.5%. 80% of its strength had served for fewer than 4 years, and it was never to achieve more than 81% of its official establishment. So amidst all these rows and controversy in Parliament and in the public and in the press, should we perhaps, if we move on now, to consider whether there might have been a little bit more, or should have been a little bit more contemporary faith in what the TF would be likely to do? So let's begin by looking at its facilities, its training, and by implication, morale. What I'll do is I'll take leadership at the end. Now, for most people, the obvious manifestation of the Territorials was the drill hall. The county associations had taken over these from the volunteer force and inherited an incredibly confused and unfathomable, basically, system of tenancies. And that is something which still perplexes the MOD today, trying to sort out who actually owns the drill halls, those few that still do exist. There was a huge building programme. For example, Devonshire had 20 buildings in 1911 going up at various parts of the county. There were loans made available from the Public Works Loan Commission, but that is a fairly typical Haldane era. That's just a company headquarter, in other words, about 110 men, and those are the ones that are scattered all over the country, rather than the previous volunteer ones, which tended to house the whole battalions, in other words, 1,000 men. Until this building programme was really underway, the local companies and sections and platoons had to make use of hired chapels, of ice rinks, and even cooperative halls. But the War Office tried to put the brake. They thought there are too many of these things being built. The local associations agitated, of course, no, they're not. We need these things. The War Office just began, or continued, I should say, its usual obstruction towards the Territorials or the auxiliaries, or call them what you will at the time. The units that could build themselves a new hall put in billiard tables, gas ranges, comfortable messes, and so on, again to the disgust of the War Office, who said this is far too lavish, you don't need these things. The association said, yes, of course we do, because if we don't offer these facilities, people aren't going to enlist. They were aids to recruitment. So too was the training equipment. When the county association said we need to buy things like dummy horses to practice harnessing, we need PT equipment, we need bayonet fighting practices. Oh no, you don't, say the War Office. If you can get it out of your ordinary grant, so be it, but don't expect anything extra in order to provide these sorts of facilities. One enterprising association even asked if they could hold a flag day in their town. And again, that was absolute shock horror as far as the War Office was concerned, because the British Army does not have flag days. So that was knocked on the head as well. The principal concern, as far as most of the detractors of the TF were concerned, was its musketry, which most people generally believed was little better than woeful. And they were probably right in that. No matter how many ranges the local associations wanted to build, and believe me, it was a huge number, most of them had to make do with 30-yard ranges, often in the basement of buildings like that. There were some big ones, of course, but they had to be shared very often by the National Rifle Association and sometimes by the regulars as well. Sorry, that should have come up with the Flag Day bit. This was a means by which they did try to get recruits. Any given civic day, you would find the local territorial force in their marching out uniforms if, and it's a big if their county association decided they were going to give them a marching out uniform. You had the choice. You had one working uniform and a marching out uniform, or two working uniforms, which were slightly cheaper. And so that's what often some of the county associations did. But anything to draw civic attention to the fact they were there at the 1910 coronation, that sort of thing, it had to try and have a high profile. That was another means by which recruits were sought, bands passing through the town centres, playing in the town centre bandstand, that sort of thing. The War Office again believed that the Territorial Army was obsessed with bands, didn't want to finance them, but it was part and parcel of recruitment. That's the one I was trying to get to. I did warn you, didn't I? This, just a typical day's shooting. when do you do it? We'll come to that in a moment. But how good were they? Well, in 1911, Jack Seeley, the Secretary of State, breathed a huge sigh of relief because the actual pass rate of Territorial infantry had increased to 71%. So he reported in Parliament. Now, there were plenty of people who disagreed with that and said, yeah, all right, so maybe 71% have fired that course successfully. And that's where the question comes. And Seeley begins to then get a little bit more defensive. Well, which course did they fire, says the MP. Well, they fired the course. Yes, but was it the course that you fire when you fail the first one, which someone who is almost blind can pass? Yes, said Seeley. And that, again, was part and parcel of the problem. They used the long at Lee Enfield, as I said. It's much criticised. It had a poor backside. The rangefinders that the Territorials used were inferior to the regulars, not enough of them. There was a survey done, and again, this is biased. Remember the context of this. The 97 commanding officers of infantry battalions were asked to report what they thought of the musketry in their battalion. And I think these were probably deliberately chosen COs who probably belonged to the National Service League as well. Of those 97, 85 of them said that my battalion is inefficient in musketry. Another report said that only 34 of the 184 battalions were deemed efficient. Whatever facts and figures you want to take, the consensus generally was that the Territorials weren't very good at musketry. Why? We're coming into a period of golf, when more and more people are playing golf. And you look, if you can, you're probably not that interested, but if you had the opportunity, look at the number of golf courses that are being built and created in England just before the First World War. And where are these golf courses coming from? Land that often used to be ranges. And farmers are now far more prepared to rent their land out to a golf course than they are for a musketry range. It's one of the problems. Crazy one, so it sounds, but believe me, honest, I tell you no lies. What was more efficient was the Territorial RGA. Its batteries and its companies were usually up to establishment. Its personnel were often drawn from the works that actually made the guns. And like the RE Fortress companies, electric light companies who worked with them, they were acknowledged as being skilled and enthusiastic technicians who took a pride in their work. Unfortunately, you can't say the same about the Royal Horse Artillery and the Royal Field Artillery. Each of the 14 TF divisions had an RHA battery and a heavy battery, and there were 151 RFA batteries. 2 RHA and 29 RFA were actually up to establishment in 1913. That's all. They had the 15-pounder gun. The War Office had repeatedly said, we'll modernise it, we'll get it up to speed, we'll bring it on, we'll have all the latest bits of technology to go with it, but they very rarely appeared. Something like 40% of all Territorial heavies and RFA guns were short of clinometers or rangefinders or the sorts of things that you need to make these things work properly. The training schedule, each battery had 200 rounds a year to fire, but they didn't fire them every year. What you did was you camped 1 year where you just practiced drills, horse riding, that sort of thing, and you used your 400 shells the next year. That was the idea behind it, and if you didn't fire all your 400 shells in the summer camp, you could do it at the weekend camps. But to do it at weekend camps, you needed to hire horses. So do you then just use Saturday afternoon and hire horses for that? Or do you think, well, it's only a little bit longer to hire them for a complete day on a Sunday? So if you go for that, then you get complaints from local people. saying the noise is too much, as they do on the musketry ranges on a Sunday as well. It's NIMBYism 1913 style, essentially. Excuse me again. There are only 5 artillery ranges used by the regulars and the TF in the entire country in 1913. Guns could fire out to sea, which was a fine idea, at least you've got your crews firing, but that means you cannot have any coordinated or joint manoeuvres with yeomanry or infantry because they ain't going to be able to operate out at sea. And it was actually possible for a man to have camped for 5 years and never to have fired a shot from his field piece on an inland range. That's how bad the situation was. Everyone realised that you're going to need at least 9 months to get the territorial artillery anywhere near efficient. And most people believed as well that the only way you could improve it is by putting regulars in command of the batteries. And there was a scheme of gradual replacement, which had begun in 1912. It's still going to be nowhere near completion by 1914, but there are more regulars in command of the batteries by the time war actually breaks out. The CRA of the division can do as much as he wants and as much as he tries to do, but if you have a fairly sort of stuck in the mud TF battery commander, then there's not much the CRA himself can actually do about that. There's an air of pessimism about the artillery. Parliament always questions there, saying, and people saying, why don't we just disband the territorial artillery, use the money for more regular batteries, we will need fewer of them because they'll be that much more efficient. And then there's that lovely story in one of the regimental histories when out on manoeuvres one day, there's a battery up on the cliff tops. This was somewhere in East Yorkshire, and the divisional general galloped up to a battery commander and he says, well then, young man, you'll be able to thwart any German invasion coming towards us, won't you? You'll be able to stop these ships and blow them out of the water. And the CO said, I think we might be able to hit the sea. And that's basically the faith in the territorial artillery. That's a bunch of fanatics. In every battalion, you had the MG fanatics. They really were sort of specialists. They were a law unto themselves as far as most COs were concerned. When they went out on manoeuvres, I apologise for the photo, but the machine gun cart is there, and the existing orders for the volunteers in the old days, any volunteer regiment that did have a machine gun, was told that the cart should be pulled by a mule, and if no mule was available, by an intelligent NCO. Right, camping. No matter how enthusiastic the county association committees might be, you couldn't get troops to camp if their own civilian employers did not allow them the time for leave. Same problem as it is today. The voluntary system for home defence needed to recruit and retain people who had attended camp technically for 2 weeks. That's what they were supposed to do. But how do you get men to attend camp for 2 weeks? The government made the concession in 1913, because such was the concern about this, that it would pay the employers and the employees national insurance for the time they were at camp. And then in 1914, the government was actually going to go even bolder and pay a £1 levy. Sorry, a £1 bounty. God, levy, yes. It's not far removed from reality, really, that. But they would pay any chap who is camping for the full 14 days £1. That was to be paid 1914. It was only those associations which camped early on at Easter and Whit that actually drew that. But that suggested that this was a great incentive, because those numbers did increase. Of course, most associations camped in July or August, so who knows what was going to have happened then. But in 1912, another major concession was made in that separation allowances were then extended to even privates. NCOs and officers had them paid before then, but now the lowest of the low private was going to be able to draw separation allowance if he was married. And again, the first quarter of 1913 suggested that this was actually having a very positive effect on the number of people who were able to camp. It was those numbers which were pored over in Parliament continuously. They can do fun things like that and delve about in rivers. That is one of my favourite photographs, and again, it probably doesn't come out too well where you are. We talk of the ridicule that the population was supposed to have of the territorials. That is a summer's day in Oldham, right? Now, you can see the weaving sheds, you can see the spinning mills. But the important point is that this is June, during the Wakes holiday, and the TF are off to camp. There is an enormous crowd who cheer them off. They're not just all friends and relatives either, and this was reflected all across the country. When they went off to camp, the town usually turned out to wave and cheer them off. That leads to the next obvious question, is it really? Were they really thought to be that much of a bunch of sort of Saturday afternoon soldiers, of being efficient, being awful, Haldane's horse, dog shooters, all these sorts of names that they get called? Or was there actually a reasonable degree of faith and interest in what the Territorial Force was up to? That's just one battalion camp. Now, it's relatively easy to get one battalion to camp. It's darn sight more difficult to get a brigade and even a division. And the War Office even said, we do not want divisional camps for the TF unless we grant it special permission. If you want to send a battalion to camp, assuming it's at full strength, then think of the number of bell tents you're going to need for the men alone. Each one houses, 8 or 10 blokes. Then there's all the messing tents. Then there's the officers' tents. Then there's the horse lines and all this sort of thing. It takes an enormous amount of ground. If you want to do that with a brigade, times that by 4. Many associations use the same grounds time and time again, but at different times of the year, because other associations were using it at the same time as well, or at a different time. Farmers wised up to this. In the past, until about 1910, farmers were quite content to allow the land to be used, providing they got compensation for the crops and the grass that might have been damaged. Then they look around to see what the local shops are getting out of camps and what the local contractors, the tent manufacturers and so on. And the farmers think, I could cash in on this. So they start charging. So this becomes a major consideration as far as the annual finance is concerned. You also need to hire an awful lot of horses. How do you provide sufficient horses for, and even a field ambulance needs 38 of the things, right? Now, how are you going to get all of those at a time when Britain is beginning, and it's slow, but it's beginning to go towards the internal combustion engine? There aren't sufficient horses around who can do the job. Associations, some of them begin their own riding schools. They keep a nucleus of 12, sometimes 18 horses, which they keep there for their own use. Everything else has to be hired from all different parts of the country, when all associations, well, not all, but many are also trying to camp and hire them at the same time. The poor old things are bunged on trains and travel from Scotland down to Penzance. When they come off, they're in a poor state. Many of them are lame. They're rejected when they arrive at camp. They're bunged back on the trains and sent off. Some of them never even get back to their owners. There is this lamentable want of horsemanship, as one of the War Office reports says. Huge problem, huge amount of money. But going back to the brigade camp, West Riding Division tried doing one in Ripon in 1911. It meant that 71 different farmers and tenants had to be approached because of access to the land that was going to be used by that brigade. Think of the paperwork, the admin and so on for that. It's a disincentive. And furthermore, who on earth wants to go and camp in Ripon? There's the seaside nearby, isn't there? Every county association petitions the War Office remorselessly. We need seaside camps. It's for recruitment. The War Office thinks, all they want to do is get their feet wet. They don't want to do any proper training. No, you can't do it. They eventually, in 1912, say, all right, you can have 1 in 3 years at a seaside. But that's all. Right? It was a huge inducement to men working in industrial cities and pits and foundries and things like that to be able to have 2 weeks at the seaside. But can you take those 2 weeks? Will your employer let you do it? Take the 4 battalions of the East Lancashire Brigade. All draw their men from 4 different cotton towns in East Lancashire. But each of them has a different wakes fortnight. So you can't get all of those 4 battalions together because they're not on holiday at the same time. Likewise, think of the Lincolnshires and the Leicestershire Brigade. The foundry weeks over in Lincolnshire don't coincide with the holiday period in Leicestershire for those 2 battalions. Those are the sorts of problems that they're facing. RE horses, building, as I say, lots of practice of building trestle bridges. They seemed obsessed by that. That's camp in 1908. That's the London Scots. Hardly sort of recommended as far as, well, health maybe, but not as far as comfort is concerned. The botulism tent of the cookhouse. East Lancashire Division it got permission in 1908 to do a division camp down on Salisbury Plain. 400 troops ended up in hospital. Those are the postcards which were sent often from home to the troops at camp, rather than the other way around, because everyone expected it was going to rain at camp, and it usually did. But you can dress up in your marching uniform, your walking out uniform, and those are the NCOs. You can have a good time, put your medals on. You know, that's part and parcel of camp life, and that's the good bit of it, if you like. This lot, I don't know who they are. They're one of the London battalions. Very rare photo because they've got their sun protectors out on their neck. Must have been one of the very few fine days of camp. And that's, again, contrast that with those blokes we saw at the Royal Horse Artillery weekend camp, who looked a pretty bunch of tough lads. This is inside Bunhill Row. These are the London Rifle Brigade doing their Swedish drill. Look, the physique of these blokes compared to what you would come across in the towns and the cities. The West Riding Division, I'll start again. The War Office did its assessment of the West Riding Division in 1910 at one of its manoeuvres, and it described the men of particularly the 7th Duke of Wellington's as simply being miserable specimens. There were assessments of troops of the Home Counties Division and of the East Anglian Division, who it was thought could barely carry their own kit because they were thought to be such poor physical specimens. That's a contrast. Football, hugely important. If you think as well of the London Scottish, the London Welsh, those rugby teams originating from territorial and volunteer routes as well. Again, the more elite or exclusive battalions could even do things like that. But they had private income. They charged a subscription for being a member, and those, on top of sort of suffering the ridicule, you actually had to pay to suffer that ridicule as well. That's a much nicer photo, I think, of territorials at the time, in that they look far more typical. It's a smoky, smoggy atmosphere. They're scruffy. They've all got fags on, and they just look as if they've just come out of the pit or the foundry. Now, very briefly, Imperial Service. One chap on that photo has the Imperial Service badge upon his right breast pocket. Haldane had always hoped that more territorials would volunteer. Something like 19,000, which was almost identical to the number of the rifle volunteers who had fought in South Africa, volunteered for the imperial service obligation. Of course, once 1914 comes, then it's going to be a different tale, but without sort of going too far on, remember, by no means did every territorial volunteer for overseas service. So what about command and control, just fairly briefly? 1912, Sir John French described the task of divisional and brigade commanders of TF units as being far more demanding than commanding regular troops. And he wanted commands to be given to young, capable, and more active men, he said. He didn't want to be interpreted that given command of a territorial brigade or division meant necessarily it's the end of your career, or we're going to pull you out of half pay and give you this because you haven't been a bad chap in the past. Right? He wanted it to be seen more as a stepping stone towards a better command. And he decided on a clear out. He wanted to get rid of many of the regulars who were in command, who were, he thought, not up to the job. And this was a good thing as far as the territorials were concerned, because they thought, great, maybe we'll have more of our own put in as brigade commanders. And who knows, maybe ultimately even a divisional commander. That was not to be. As you probably know, there were only 2 territorials, genuine territorials, who were in command of infantry brigades in 1914. A lot of it was to do with pay. There were issues as far as the regulars saw it of being given command of these units, and that was why some of them were reluctant to do it. But of the 14 major generals in command of the divisions in 1913, they'd all been commissioned by 1881. They were all in their 50s. If war hadn't broken out a year later, they'd have probably been lucky most of them, to have got another command. That's not by means all of them, because think of Monroe, he was there, and of course he went on. There are others as well. 6 of them had been GOC for more than 2 years, and all but one of them was actually infantry. 9 of them had served, none of them had served as adjutant or with the territorials or the rifle volunteers. So most of them had little idea, actually, of what the territorials were essentially all about. Again, a classic example of this is Kitchener, who has no idea, basically, what the Special Reserve or the Territorial Force is when he comes back from India. There are very many serving major generals who suffered from that same problem. The brigade commanders did tend to spend about 2 years only in command before generally they did move on. And 1913, you're beginning to see this period when, yes, the younger brigade commanders were in post, and then they did move on to better things, as they would see it, i.e. regular commands, once war broke out. 3 of them had been in command of their brigade since 1910, but there are an awful lot of them as well who don't go overseas in 1914. They are replaced in August and September, in the same way as very many of the major generals are, 5 of them in fact. The promise to increase the size of the territorial divisional staff, which had been made back in 1909, was never fulfilled, which meant that you had a GSO2 as the chief staff officer. They were made up to GSO1 in 1914, but the important point here, all of them in 1913 had actually attended staff college. So in theory, they knew what they were doing as far as administration was concerned and planning, but of course they've got to work with a bunch of real sort of idiosyncratic individuals, because so many of the territorial force commanders were basically sort of loopy as far as the way that they commanded in comparison to regulars was concerned. The commanding officers themselves, think of the old army adage, there's no such thing as a bad regiment, just a bad CO. And that was so much the case for so very many. They were there because their dad had had the job before in the Rifle Volunteers. That doesn't mean to say that they were all poor, because there were plenty who put an awful lot of commitment in to trying to get their battalions or their batteries or whatever they might be into good, efficient working order. But pressure of work, commercial interests and so on, sometimes, of course, impinged upon that. The company commander, I think, is the crucial individual as far as the TF is concerned. He's the chap who most territorial soldiers see most of the time. He can be dynamic, he can be a sort of gold medal winner like Summers Smith, he can be an international rugby player like Young of the 8th Cameronians, he can be genuinely old, they can be the people like Pilkington from St Helens who own half the town, they can be the Beck, as it were, from the Sandringham Company. These are people of local stature, and often it's down to them as to whether you have an efficient and, above all, a full company or battalion or battery. So, as 1914 approaches, but in 1913, the War Office is actually a little bit less concerned about the state of the territorials. The decision, as we say, has been made that the two other regular divisions would join the BEF. But the chance of an invasion is thought to be remote until Kitchener comes along and screws it all up by saying, of course, yes, November the 20th is going to be an invasion. And that, of course, puts everything back into the melting pot again. But the traditional bias of the regulars against the TF was still there. And it was still very evident to members of the TF themselves. They understood that, they were prepared to go along with it, in the hope that if they made themselves that much more efficient, then ultimately they would get the recognition they felt they deserved. The War Office was mostly concerned with the quality of NCOs in the TF. The COs could be replaced. There was a regular adjutant. There were regular permanent staff. But the big missing link, as far as most regulars were concerned, was the quality of the NCOs, who they thought were incapable of commanding their men effectively or efficiently. They didn't like the discipline in the Territorial Force either. But again, that was something which many in the War Office thought, well, if war does come, then discipline will fall into place. So it wasn't any longer an overriding consideration. The important point is, perhaps, that the signallers, those there, were considered to be something like about 75% as efficient as the regulars were. The RAMC, again, thought to be about 70 to 75% as efficient as the regulars. It was the infantry who were down to about, it was assessed at about sort of 50% as efficient as the regulars. The engineers were up to about 70% as well, as I said. There's a great disparity, but above all, of course, there is an enormous gap in the numbers of those serving and the actual establishment. They do confound their critics, of course, in 1914. The scepticism, as far as the regulars, they earn the regulars' plaudits and so on once they start going over. But that, of course, is a different story, and that's where I'll leave it now, because I'm getting horrible signs from Colin that I've gone over time. Ladies and gentlemen, thank you very much for...
James Maloney wants to marry me, and so leave the Strand and Piccadilly, or you'll be to blame. For love has fairly drove me silly, hoping you're the same. It's a long way to Tipperary, it's a long way to go. It's a long way to Tipperary, to the sweetest girl I know. Goodbye, Piccadilly, farewell, let us swear. It's a long, long way to Tipperary.